Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome, after a break, to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. And Jacob, as you were saying just a moment ago, there's lots to talk about. And let's start with Windrush. There is a view that the treatment of the Windrush children was inherent in the so-called hostile environment policy, introduced, I think, though not under that term originally, by Labour, then accentuated by Theresa May as Home Secretary, in which landlords, other people in civil society were asked to play a part in checking people's status in Britain by collaborating with the authorities about their papers and so on. Now, do you think this claim is correct, that if the Windrush children are to be treated justly, or other groups like them, the hostile environment policy has to go?
The hostile environment policy actually goes back quite a long time. It goes back to requiring employers to institute checks, and that goes back to the Major government in the late 1990s. And there are intrinsic problems with it, because you have to look at why this was brought about. And the reason it was brought about was because the Home Office had failed to keep control of our borders, that exit checks were dropped, we were beginning to have less idea of who was actually in the country. And so the answer of the state was to say that we will outsource this state responsibility of keeping our borders safe to individuals. And it went further and further. So it started with employers, then it became landlords, then it became banks. And you have to ask whether it is the job of each of us going about our business to be seeking for illegal immigrants, or whether actually the government has a responsibility to run the borders agency efficiently to ensure that we know who's coming into this country and that people who come into this country leave at the end of the expiry of their visa. And I'm not convinced, and have been convinced, that it is the job of, as you put it, civil society to enforce the criminal law when the state has failed to do so. Of course, we should cooperate with the state. We have an interest in being part of a single society. But that to try and get the private sector to pick up where the state has failed is intrinsically problematic.
Can you think of any other instance where civil society is asked to do this?
It's quite hard to think of another instance where civil society is expected to do this. If you take the equivalent of paying traders in cash, the law-abiding citizen has no obligation to try and find out whether the person who is mending a broken pipe is paying VAT or income tax or anything else. And when a government minister at one point suggested that we should all make sure that our tradesmen were paying the right amount of tax, this was greeted with hilarity as an absurd proposition, and that it simply isn't the job of individuals to pretend that they are inspectors from HMRC.
So in this situation, oddly enough, you're lined up, though for different reasons, with The Guardian, with left-wing academics, with a big section of immigration barristers, in thinking really that this hostile environment policy is a bad thing.
The reason I come to my conclusion is because I have very strong belief in our ancient liberties. And one of the greatest liberty that we have as Britons is that we can go about our lawful business without having to prove to anybody who we are. The state has no right to say to us, who are you and what are you doing? That as long as we are not breaking the law, there should be no need for the state to stop us or demand to see our papers. And if you look at the European angle of this, there is a very strong one, because the continental state has historically been a top-down state, and this ties in with Napoleonic law and the civil code, that the state is powerful and the individual is there to fit in with the state. In our system, with the common law, it's always been the other way around, and that the state will only act to limit what you are allowed to do if there is good reason to do so and with the consent of your representatives in Parliament. This has made us a very free and liberal society, And I think that anything that attacks that is dangerous and makes us less free and gives the state more control over our lives, which, as a Conservative, I'm not in favour of.
And how do these principles, in your view, apply then in future to the treatment of EU nationals? Because obviously our EU interlocutors in the negotiation are all over Windrush and saying, well, if we can't trust you Brits and your Home Office to treat these people fairly, how can we possibly trust you to treat our citizens fairly?
It is an important question because we can, as a country, be trusted to treat people fairly. We believe in treating people fairly, and we have a system of law that ensures that people are treated fairly. But we have a major and long-standing question about the sheer competence of the Home Office. And this is not new. This is not Amber Rudd's fault. It's not Theresa May's fault. It goes back a long time. It goes back before John Reid made his comment about the Home Office not being fit for purpose. So I can see why they're concerned. I think the reassurance we can give is that this will be a new system, that everyone will know where they stand, that it's being made quite clear. You see, with the Windrush generation, the law got changed again and again and again. And so the situation they were in 1968 by 2010 had changed half a dozen times. With the EU nationals, it will be a date, a deadline, that'll be it. It will be quite clear what steps are necessary to prove your right to be here, and you'll be given a time in which to do it. That seems an easier system to implement, because when the 1971 Nationality Act came in, nobody was thinking that that act would be revised again and again and again.
Can I just come back to you on this? Because when we began this conversation about Windrush, you stated pretty much this is a policy problem. This is government outsourcing something it should do to everyone else. You've now said in your last answer, this isn't just a policy problem, this is an implementation problem because you can't trust the Home Office to do these things properly.
Well, it's clearly an implementation problem because the government would never have outsourced it in the first place if it had actually been competent at keeping immigration under control. So the starting point is the implementation fails, and so the government says, well, we'll throw this implementation as a matter of policy onto the private individual. And so it's a double failure.
You run up, I suppose, at the start into a chicken egg question of whether the implementation is the original problem or whether the implementation is a response to the policy. Leaving all that aside, do you think we need some sort of inquiry into the way the Home Office works in the light of Windrush, given that we have the EU nationals to deal with, not just the EU nationals, the Home Office has got to administer and oversee an entirely new immigration system for everyone coming in from abroad?
It doesn't necessarily have to have a new system for everybody. It could simply say that the system that applies to everybody else applies to people coming from the EU, which is, I think, the most sensible thing that it could do and is what it should do. There's no reason once we've left to have a different immigration system for EU nationals. They should be treated like the rest of the world. And it would not, to my mind, be in the spirit of Brexit if they were to do anything else. And it shouldn't be part of the negotiation with the EU.
You're not in favour then, in principle, of, as part of trade deals with whoever, might be India, it might be the EU, giving their citizens more right to enter than countries with which we won't have future trade deals?
That's a slightly different matter. Nobody's talking about the free movement of people and an absolute right to come. But within any immigration system, you have a certain number of places that are available, and you have a certain number of countries that you feel confident about where you don't need visas at all. So would it be reasonable to say to a friendly nation that we think you should have immigration on the basis of the United States, where we don't require visas for business people coming in for a short business visit? If India were to ask for that, would that be unreasonable? No, it wouldn't. So in a unified immigration system, you still have gradations. You don't say to every country in the world, this is the one visa application that you have. You say, are you coming on holiday? Are you coming on business? Do you want to move permanently? But you slot the EU into that system rather than developing a whole new special system for the EU.
I wasn't just asking about visas, I was asking about numbers, whether you move the numbers up and down. in relation to trade deals?
I don't think with trade deals you're talking about permanent settlement. You're talking about people coming for 6 months to carry out a software contract or coming over for 2 weeks for a business conference. The issue with numbers is on how many work permits you're going to get, how many people are coming for permanent or semi-permanent settlement. And those permanent settlements shouldn't be part of a trade deal, but actually allowing people to come and do business may be a reasonable part of the trade deal. But I think these are different because one is permanent, one is an increase in the population of the United Kingdom, the other is simply making it a little bit easier for people to come and then go again within a few weeks or a few months.
Okay, talking of trade deals takes us to the wider question of the customs union and Brexit. In very broad terms, do you have confidence in the government's handling of the Brexit negotiation to date?
Yes, in broad terms. I made no bones about the fact that I don't like the transition deal, but it's clear where the government intends to go. The Mansion House speech was clear as to the end destination, and that is that we're out of the customs union, out of the single market, out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and the Prime Minister has consistently confirmed that. I think there's been a lot of sound and fury over the last few days on the customs union. There's been no change in government policy.
I asked you if you were happy with the direction of travel to date, because in a number of specific instances, I think you're not. You weren't happy with us not being able to take back some control of fishing after the Brexit date, were you?
No, I've been absolutely clear. I think the transition deal was a bad deal. And I can only I can live with the transition deal because of where the government says the end state will be. The transition deal in and of itself was completely unsatisfactory.
And just on another element of that transition deal, you really weren't happy with the government continuing free movement as now under the transition deal?
No, I wasn't happy with any of it because it basically meant that we were remaining in the EU for another 21 months without any say in what was going on. I think the transition deal was a mistake, and that the worry about the transition deal is that the government kept on saying it wouldn't do these things and then did them.
That's what I wanted to ask
That's
you.
the problem.
The government did say originally, we're going to begin to act on free movement as soon as we enter transition, and then dropped off that. But despite that, you still have confidence in the government's
The Prime
handling.
Minister said a few weeks before free movement was accepted that it wouldn't be accepted. The Secretary of State for Agriculture said a few days before that we would keep fish. That was a very unsatisfactory agreement. But the one thing they were clear about was that the end state was still going to be intact. Now, that I accept, and there's no evidence to the contrary.
Right, so you still have confidence in them, even though they backed off what they said on migration and transition?
Yes.
Okay, which takes us to the customs union. Of course, the government is out and about, making it very clear that the official position remains, which is that we are leaving the customs union, so on and so forth. What's your advice to colleagues in the Commons who want to stay in the customs union, will be expressing that view on Thursday in the debate, and will later be voting presumably on pro-customs union amendments to the EU withdrawal bill?
Well, my advice to them is that they should try and have won the last referendum. And they didn't, they lost it. And the government sent out a leaflet saying that we were going to leave the customs union and the single market. The Conservative Party had an election manifesto that said we would leave the customs union and the single market. So unless Conservative MPs put out their own specific election address contradicting the manifesto, it must be assumed that they supported the manifesto upon which they stood, and therefore are tied in to supporting that aspect of policy. I always put out my own election address, and if there are areas of government policy that I'm not so sympathetic to, I make it clear to the constituents of North East Somerset. And I'm sure that some of the Remain supporters will have done that, but not all of them.
This isn't so serious a matter that if they did vote for pro-customs union amendments and hadn't put something in their own manifestos, that the withdrawal of the whip would be justified?
No, but they'd have to wrestle with their own consciences. I think people ought to tell the truth to the electorate, and they shouldn't stand on a manifesto that they don't actually believe in.
We've discussed before whether the government can or cannot make such a vote of confidence, and you pointed out it can't with the Fixed Terms Parliament Act. When push comes to shove, I suppose Theresa May could say, well, if I'm defeated on this, I will resign. Could she not?
Yes, of course she could. But you can't force somebody to be Prime Minister.
You wouldn't advise using that particular gambit?
Well, I'd think it through. Where do you get to? Say, for convenience, that this vote on the customs union is made a vote of confidence and it's lost. So the Prime Minister goes to see the Queen and hands over the seals of office. What does the Queen immediately say to the Prime Minister? She says, will you form an interim administration until I can find a new Prime Minister? So she hands over the seals of office, she's given them straight back. She then goes back to Downing Street. So exactly as she is. No cabinet minister's gone, everything's the same. The Queen then realises that the only person who has a majority in the House of Commons is Theresa May, who is asked to form a government. So within 10 days, she's back as Prime Minister, having resigned for a minute. That's one way it could happen. The other way, the Prime Minister goes in, she hands over the seals of office, and she says, I'm not going to be Prime Minister. And the Queen says, well, will you form an interim administration? Theresa May says, no. At which point we have no government, because there's nobody else who can form an administration that would command a majority in the House of Commons. The Queen would probably have to send for Jeremy Corbyn, who could not form a government that would command a majority. He would then be faced with the choice of putting down a vote of no confidence in himself. But if he did, there's a fortnight in which the Queen has to see if she can find another government, which would be Theresa May. So I think the Fixed Term Parliament Act really complicates this. And yes, it is possible that a government in a very difficult state could say to the Queen, we will simply have no government. We will leave it up to you to fulfil your reserved constitutional duty of finding a Prime Minister. And we'll leave a vacuum in the interim.
While we're in this...
But I think this is very unlikely.
While we're in this hypothetical vein, couldn't Theresa May say to the Prime Minister, well, I've made this a vote of confidence, I've lost. I'm not taking back the seals of office, but I'm advising you, Prime Minister, that my effective deputy, well, some people wouldn't regard him as my deputy, but he's the most senior person on the cabinet list. I advise Mr. David Lidington could form a government. I'm advising you to send for him.
What is the one thing upon which the outgoing Prime Minister cannot advise the Sovereign? On the name of the successor. That's a matter for the Sovereign alone. It's not a matter for advice.
The Prime Minister is really not allowed to suggest that you might send for someone
else. The Prime
else.
Minister may suggest a name, but may not formally advise. And I think with...
all right, well, we're dancing around.
No, it's quite important because I think that would face the Queen with an immeasurably difficult political question of should she call for the leader of the opposition or should she call for the person suggested by the Prime Minister, and therefore the Prime Minister would be behaving improperly in suggesting a name.
The Prime Minister might say you might want to talk to.
I think with the system of electing a leader within the Conservative Party, I don't think it would be easy for the Queen to pick any Member of Parliament to carry out that role.
So, in short, what you're saying is if Theresa May doesn't take one of the two routes that you've advised, you face a constitutional crisis of one sort or another. In fact.
Yes.
And there isn't time for Theresa May to say, well, I will hang on and we're going to call a snap leadership elections, and it isn't easy to see how that could happen under the current rules.
That's right. There's then 3 months of... so it ceases to be a confidence vote. A confidence vote requires something to happen quickly, not something to happen 3 months later. And so I think it's unrealistic. I think, yes, of course, the Prime Minister can always say, look, I've had enough, I'm not going to do it, and I'm stopping doing it now. But it would be a very irresponsible thing to do, and whatever else we know or don't know about Theresa May, She is a very responsible person. She's a very dutiful person.
I think enough of this speculative line of inquiry for which I'm entirely responsible. But I want to close with a question about the so-called partnership model of the customs union. What is your view?
It was completely idiotic. It's hard to think of a sillier way of trying to set up a customs arrangement, and it would de facto keep us in the single market, because we would collect tariffs and then send them on. But for them to be eligible to be imported into the EU, they'd also have to meet all the standards regulations. So either we're going to have endless strands, a couple of tariff strands and then a couple of regulation strands, which nobody's talked about, or you would find that we're de facto in the single market.
So while not on paper being incompatible with negotiating and signing our own trade deals, I take it as part of the point of this thing, I don't suppose it's very encouraging if you're the Australians, say, to be coming to do a negotiation and be told, we will be collecting a tariff, but don't you worry, you'll get it back.
No, because the tariff is mainly trivial. It's the non-tariff barriers that are important. And as far as I can tell, this partnership would leave the non-tariff barriers in place. So it's a really badly thought through scheme. It won't work. It's enormously complicated. It would be very bureaucratic for importers to use. It should be knocked on the head.
Why it hasn't been knocked on the head? I mean, David Davis and co. have had to go around the EU with two proposals rather than one, and it's only this week that the Cabinet Committee is going to decide which one it's to adopt. It's a bit late, isn't it?
Well, we've had a very interesting time discussing constitutional conundrums that probably will never arise, and the government has been discussing a customs conundrum that will probably never arise. So these things happen in politics. You discuss things that don't, when you've examined them carefully, work.
But, I mean, just to be clear, to a final question, I mean, your advice to the Cabinet Committee that meets, I think, tomorrow is to finally put an end to this thing.
Oh, yes.
And cast it out and proceed by more conventional means.
Of course, that's the obvious thing to do, and to be robust with the EU over the Irish question.
Go on.
Well, because that's where a lot of this comes from, is how do you solve the Irish question? Well, you solve the Irish question by simply saying, we're not going to put up a border, what are you going to do? Because both the EU and the Irish government don't want to have a border, and then you just make things work. It's not difficult. There already is a border in terms of VAT and excise, and you just carry on policing it in the same way as it's currently done.
There's so much more to say, and unfortunately, we're going to have to end there, though the Moggcast will return in a fortnight. Jacob, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.